Is everything
Yep,
going?
you're on.
Okay. So, part of why we're wanting to chat with you today is to talk about unfurrowed ground. And I'm wondering if you remember when you ever first heard that term, or it became apparent to you from things that had happened in your family.
Well, it was probably it was the time when I was constructing my life and my parents' life as they died, and I was writing their eulogy that I presented at the church to sum up for the crowd that sometimes knew a part of my parents' life and my life, but not all of it. And so when I look to sum up the reason why they were important was that they were people who saw the unplowed ground, and their lives were dedicated really to plowing a furrow through unplowed ground.
I'm almost certain that as you were a child growing up, that those instances weren't obvious to you or pointed out. But maybe looking back, do you recognize instances where they were teaching you the same thing without calling it them? Or put you in situations where you would be the person plowing?
Much more the latter than the former. The first experience that I can relate was when they chose to send me to private school in the first grade. And the private school was a school in Cambridge, Massachusetts called the Shady Hill School, and it was clear in my mind that it was important to them that I do well there, because they had said almost offhand that you would be the only, at the term at the time was a Negro student at the school, the first. And so that was my first sense that they saw this as unplowed ground, and that I would be instrumental in plowing that first furrow through.
Now, how did that make you feel at the time? And then how did that make you feel later in your life when you look back at that?
Well, I was pretty thick-skinned, pardon the pun, but the sense was that I didn't see it as anything great special at the time. Later on, certainly following the sense that that it was important, it certainly became important to the school and important to the parents of my fellow students in my grade, that I was there and had to be treated with concern and care.
Can you elaborate on that for me, Dick, as to instances where it felt like you had to be treated with concern?
Well, certainly I was made aware at times that I was the subject of discussion among parents, of classmates, and the administration of the school. A woman by the name of Catherine Taylor was the head of school, and she took a very active part in how I was doing and discussion with parents when the subject of my participation came up, such as in later in the upper school when fellow classmates were dating and showing interest in other students, especially male-female kind of interactions. That it was very there was discussion, and I knew of the discussion, but I didn't I didn't realize it was special. I realized that there was something different, but I didn't realize it was as different as it turned out to be.
So in many cases, did it feel like for you that those things were normal because it's what you had experienced from the first grade?
Yes, yeah. That there was something special. I didn't know what it was. It was sort of like a sense that the atmosphere on the playfields, the team kind of sports, all of that sort of thing was a natural sort of thing. But there was some interest and concern about the relationship that the school had with the other activities, such as when the school was had a kind of contract with an organization called the Cambridge Skating Club, and the Cambridge Skating Club was something that accepted Shady Hill students to skate on the ice after school. And when I showed up, I was called off the ice and told that I could not participate. The head of school, Hirtel, was someone who was interested enough to pull Shady Hill out of that relationship with the Cambridge Skating Club, and no Shady Hill school students, after I was pulled off the ice, was permitted through school auspices to skate on the ice. So that it was the school's reply to that, something which I didn't at the time consider. I didn't cry, I didn't go home crying or anything of that sort. I just thought, I didn't know why, but something had happened. And then the upshot of it being that the relationship between Shady Hill School and the Cambridge Skating Club was kaput. So that was something that was. There was also a discussion in the later years relative to participation in what was called the dance system there, where the social sense was that schools were inviting other private schools students to come to socials, and it represented a time when other students were getting to know other people, and so it was sort of a combined sense of the private schools getting to know other private school students. There was discussion. The discussion centered not around my parents so much as the parents of my classmates, who were very concerned about how I might be treated in places other than Shady Hill School, other private schools. And winning acceptance was a kind of issue that they felt was very important to address. Some pressure was put on some of the organizers of these social events that to accept me as a participant, and some responded positively that I was welcome. Others were ones that said I would not be well received, and so that. But it was negotiated at the top of the school administration.
So do you believe, or have you ever thought about the reason as to why your parents selected that school for you to go? Was the reputation of that school such that they felt the school would become a champion for you? Because in the time that we're talking about, when you were in elementary and level schools, it was a very different time than it is right now in the United
Clearly
States.
different, clearly different. There was overt and covert discrimination all the way through the South and to some degree in the North.
Mhm.
So that certainly was something that the school, that Shady Hill School, appealed to my parents in part because they asked, the administration asked my parents because they knew my father and they knew what sort he was, and so he was someone who felt that that my father and mother had to accept that they were putting me, their only child, in some harm's way, and that it should be well considered that they would that they would have to be supportive of this and find their way through some fairly sticky situations. Not the least of which is the acceptance of the rest of the students in the school
Mhm.
and their parents. So that being asked, I can remember distinctly that my father was wholeheartedly in favor of this, whereas my mother was someone who was at best concerned and certainly at least fearful for not only racial but the difference between economic status and all of that sort of thing. So that could they afford it was another issue beyond race. Would it be a difference if I were offered a big scholarship? Would that have some effect on how I would be accepted? Bigger than most kind of scholarships, that kind of thing. How would it escalate? All the kinds of things that go to a major change in their lives and my life.
Mhm.
So being asked, he was there was some developing. It wasn't a real tension as much as it was that a wholehearted sense of let's do it, let's support it on the part of my dad and my mother's reluctance was what I saw, and I of course didn't know what I was in for anyway, so I just went along with what I was told to do.
And put your best foot forward because you got the sense and was told from your parents that they needed you to do well.
Yeah. Not only do well, but look well, because it was part of their sense was that I would be with people who had had the resources to do whatever they wanted to do, and they felt they weren't up to that, so I had to not only do well but look the part, that kind of thing. So I was reputed to be the best dressed person in my class.
Did you how long did you attend Shady Hill?
For 9 years, from the first grade through the 9th grade.
And then where did you go from there?
Then went to another private school, this time in Vermont. A school called Putney School. And I was among a few well, in each class, it was from the 9th grade to the 12th grade. There had to have been 2 or 3 minority individuals in each class, and so I was one of a couple out of classes of maybe 50 or 60 students.
So for the 9 years that you attended Shady Hill School, were you the only black the entire time?
No, no. The furrow became wide enough to accept several others, but it wasn't a great influx of folks. It was certainly had to do with the war and the post-war kind of things that prevented others from coming. But having cut through the barriers and having the school, which was frankly, looking back on it, was somewhat naive about what they were doing, but their interests were certainly great interest of having, breaking the barriers and thinking the problem areas through. They were naive, rightly so, but well-intended, and that well-intention was played out in what I mentioned before. Nonetheless, it was a situation, very much a situation of that it provided an opportunity for them to take in more minority individuals, and that has played out since, where there's a large minority of different sorts of people, not only including what's now referred to rather than Negroes, but African Americans and other minorities that have come into the school and enjoying the riches of private school education.
So you had basically 12 years of a private education.
Yeah.
Predominantly being either the only or one of
several.
few.
Yeah.
How do you think that's impacted you, being the person that at the time when you were doing it, plowing the unfurrowed ground, how do you look back and say, that shaped me? How?
Well, talking about the outside first, it made me want to dress like my dad, who was just a snappy dresser, a wonderful, not showy, but someone who was, I always wanted to look my best. And so it was a very important kind of thing for me to show up with clean clothes. Didn't have to be new clothes, had to be clean, reasonably well tailored. So that was the outside. Going toward the inside, my sense was that I wanted to make connections very much on the sense of speaking reasonably well, having ideas that were merchantable, if you will. So how that developed was that I tended to react to intellectual things with a little skewed view, a different view, a view that was, say, maybe unusual view of what was going on, so that that the difference was not skin, but it was thought. It was the kind of sense of viewing something with a lens that showed a different perspective. That was, and I found that got me a lot of credit for having a reasonably good mind, but a different mind. And this was important, so that that was something that has kept me well positioned in life, probably more than anything else. It's a different kind of skewed view, if you will. Not always correct, but certainly inventive, creative perhaps, but showing a reasonably facile mind. Third, going inside was that I never had the feeling of being part of a group in a way which was crippling. In other words, my sense was that I was extra a racial group, not necessarily that I wasn't African American or black or Negro but that I was, but I didn't feel that I had to be identified as such by my own efforts. So what do I mean? Well, during the 60s, there was an issue. And the issue was whether or not being black, that I and some others in college at or graduate school or working would side with the black is beautiful kind of, and you have to support only black causes and that sort of thing. Or the other alternative, which was a much more individual point, that you were like someone like Thurgood Marshall, or someone who was. Those tensions were significant. The pressures to demonstrate, to boycott, to that sort of thing was quite. And the other choice was to excel yourself and take the risks of being out there by yourself without and suffering the consequences of necessarily being thought of in the vernacular a Uncle Tom or a Oreo kind of sort of. And it was my decision, along with some others that I had contact with through joining a black fraternity, that we would choose the latter. The latter being one who would be on our own, do things that we would be supported, and hopefully that would reflect well on people who really wanted to strike out and be integrative rather than exclusive. And that still has been my mode. In the last 50 years, my sense is that when I had the choice, I would always go toward the more integrative position, as opposed to the black is beautiful necessarily. And that doesn't always play out consistently. I can remember when I was in business, and during the 60s, 70s, I was working and traveling a lot for business, and I had often my three-piece suit on and my attaché case as I was going to visit clients. And going through airports, the sky caps would look and say, and clench their fists and go, "Hey, right on, brother." And I too would raise my fist and say, "You too," so forth. So So that wasn't necessarily consistent, but it was at least the gesture that it was. I was acknowledging some supportive interest and so that it wasn't. I wasn't totally on my own denying blackness, but certainly celebrating where I was without denigrating where I was. So those three areas of concern are probably a longer answer than you wanted, but necessarily the sense of looking good, thinking well, and striking out was the tenor of what I felt made me different in going through the furrow of being hopefully someone who's contributed.
Kim, can I stop and start that one again so it doesn't shut off in the middle of whatever?
Are you doing okay? Can you drink?
Yeah. Yeah. I hope this is helpful.
Perfect.
Oh.
There is no right or wrong, because there's not a right or wrong answer here.
Well, at least I want to be interesting.
It's very interesting.
That's like there's a handful of popcorn.
Oh, take a bowl. Take the bowl with you. Yeah.
Are you ready?
I'm gonna let him eat his.
Oh yeah.
How-
I'm sorry.
you get a
No, I
sip?
didn't know if you were sitting. You were
Huh?
if you were going to ask me a
Okay.
question or if you were.
Do you want a sip? Will you
Oh,
start
I'll
with
take
dry?
another. Yeah. Thank
I
you.
don't want you to. There, during the middle of something you were saying, I felt like I was gonna start coughing. Those three areas where you talk about the impact of your 12 years of private schooling, do you think those, as you look back, that those were also influenced by your father? Do you find any of those qualities which you say how they impacted you and how you moved forward then?
I think the influences of of my parents were significant. There's no question about that. I'm a product of two people who came together from disparate areas. Mother from Fredericton, New Brunswick in Canada, and my father from roots in the south of the United States, and being born in a large family from New Rochelle, New York. And they met kind of partway between them, almost in the middle, in Boston. And both were people who had a calling, but also had a tension between them, which was born of my father being a pretty positive but assertive individual. And so he was positive in that he wanted to do things correctly, and he wanted to speak correctly. He wanted to do things the right way, that kind of thing, and had great influence over my mother, who was someone who was much more malleable. The times in families were such that the man in the husband was someone who was a breadwinner and a wife who did the bidding and maintained the home. I don't know exactly what the tension was between them, but certainly part of it was that there was another child who was stillborn 2 years after I was born. And the accusation that the doctor who delivered me delivered my dead brother, the stillborn child, botched up, and my mother was very concerned that he might do that, resisted, but my father insisted that they have the doctor that he was familiar with, and it went wrong. That tension played itself out in part because my father was adopted himself from a large family that he was given away to his uncle, who renamed him and gave him another life, which was a very privileged life in many respects. And I suspect that my mother was attributing his adoption and being given away almost as property as being something that he was prepared to be a single child, and he wanted a single child. So you can see this tension kind of, and the accusation that took place. My mother was someone who was also from a reasonably large family. She had 4 brothers, and she was the single child of a family growing up in Fredericton, New Brunswick. She came to the marriage with her husband as someone who had almost run away from the farm in Fredericton to seek her life in Boston, and to be rid of her father, who was dominating, and wound up with another dominant male person, and that tension was there, and so there was some accommodation made. I remember there was a foster child that was brought into the house, and I was old enough at that time to, I don't know whether I resented him, but I made it tough for him, so that I'm not sure that's the reason why he didn't spend a lot of time in our family, but still, and I have never followed up. I don't even remember what his name was, but I know that I made his life somewhat uncomfortable. So that this tension played itself out in somewhat the sense that though they agreed, they also were 2 people who had menus in their lives that they. My father was someone who was a bright, bookish individual who had a sense of intellectual curiosity and competition, and he graduated the top of his class from his high school, and got a full scholarship to Harvard College, and went and was one of 4 minority individuals in the class of 25 at Harvard College. And he went to work after leaving the college, and the college situation was, he was what was called a language concentrator, and he did reasonably well from all that I've been able to gather from the records there. He had in the 20s there was still a lot of segregation and discrimination. He went to work for a owner of a lumber company, and he was his chauffeur. And after 30 years there at the employ of this fellow, he ended up running the individual's business, and when the business was sold and he offered to buy the business, the owner would not sell him the business, so that he opened up his own lumber company next door, or almost next door, in competition with his original employer, that kind of thing. So he moved to have his own and to compete, and he was one of the few at the time, I'm not sure he realized it, but he probably did, being as bright as he was, that he was one of the few African American business people who opened up their own business in the 1940s, after the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War. So his sense of competition, his sense of what he wanted to do, what he was able to do, was clear, and none of these things were typical of someone of his race or of his standing. My mother, in an effort to help subsidize my private school education and to decided that she wanted to go to work, so she went to work for a department store in Boston called Filene's, which has recently not it has dissolved, but it was one of the few department stores in large department stores in the Boston area, and is certainly famous for Filene's Basement, which was a discount, one of the first discount kind of merchants in the area, financed by mostly Jewish people who were ones who employed my mother not as someone who operated one of the escalators or one of the elevators, that sort of thing, but as a salesperson, the first salesperson who was black and was had mature thought responsibility. And she stayed there for some time. So she was very successful and had all sorts of slights and that sort of thing. But the company seemed to support her, and so she was very pleased with, and she was a person who had a kind of personality that was a kind of winning personality as long as she agreed with you. When she didn't agree with you, then all hell would break loose. So that she had a virtue that still stands today, which helped, I think, the whole family out, is that she was one of the first people to see a situation as a catastrophe. And so she was a warrior in many respects, and that provided with a husband who was fairly cool and pretty good under fire, and a son who was thick-skinned and a little bit oblivious of what emergencies were. She saw much of life as part of catastrophe, that sort of thing. So we saw our way through with her help, because as seeing what the possibilities were for catastrophe in situations that we would have taken as being, usual situations, it helped us to build strategies for addressing those sorts of things, so that each had their way of coping, and I was the product of that kind of both tension and individual senses of going in different directions. It's a fairly long answer to your
It's okay.
question.
I'm gonna come back and break some things apart a little bit. Let's start with your mother.
Yeah.
So she worked at Filene's.
Yes.
Was there awareness on your part, or do you know why they chose her to become the first African American that worked in a position that was very different than the time?
I don't know why. Never knew why. I'm not sure that she knew why. My sense was that she asked, applied openly, and I'm told by some Jewish friends that it was in part because the store was owned and managed by Jewish individuals that they said, why not, and that sort of thing. So it was not something that they were forced to do, to my knowledge. My mother probably would have shrunk from putting pressure there. She was in her days, she was an attractive individual who had a presence, except when she was worrying, and but she had as a first, she looked good, and so it was a possibility.
So when she decided to go and get a job,
Yeah.
what would have been normal for an African American at that time would have been to go and ask to be somebody who ran the escalator or worked the elevators or
Yeah.
something like that. But she chose to say, I'm going to go ask to be a salesperson.
Yeah, I guess so.
So do you think that
This
was
is speculation.
Do you think that was a discussion between her and your father when they were like, we need to find a way to subsidize the private education?
No, I think it was a discussion between her and what she would accept as a job. She had her standards.
So
And,
what was normal
Yeah.
for a black person at that time was something she saw as beneath her.
I'm not sure she even had that she was going to go for something that paid more, that had some level of pride along with it, and being a people person rather than running an elevator which gave kind of periodic kind of things. She felt that she could deal with people in a fashion that would be helpful, and she probably convinced the administration that she would be a good salesperson. And that yielded probably the kind of money and the kind of prestige that she could feel comfortable having, supporting a son going to private school.
So were there stories that you heard about or discussions in your home, which I realize you were in a private school, so not living at home much.
Oh, I was living at home.
Oh, you were, okay.
Yeah, I was commuting at home.
Okay.
Yeah.
So were there stories that you remember about what she faced in plowing that unfurrowed ground as a face being seen in a role that people weren't accustomed to that?
Yeah, not as such. She would only use a story to support a point. So typical, I can remember a story of how a customer went into the ladies' room and came out naked, and apparently it was judged to be a little on the screwy side. And the point she was making to me is that if I kept on behaving the way I was behaving at the particular, I don't know what I was doing, that I was going to be driving her crazy, and she would do something strange like that. So you can see the kind of mind she had was that she would use these instances not to prove any kind of racial, but how I might be driving her out of her mind. That kind of thing is what I remember. Now, what stories she told to other people, I don't know, or at least I don't remember them. They weren't as pointed as this was pointed to me, that I was behaving in, not to her so that liking. The sense was that she competed very well with her fellow salespeople. In point of fact, now that you mention it and I think back, my sense was that she felt, and this may be a key to all of this furlough stuff, is that she felt that she was much more identifiable than many of her competitors, because she was obviously someone who wasn't white. And so that sense was that maybe she being someone who was very gracious toward people, and very much a sense of wanting people to like her, was also a way of getting identification, which some of the others didn't have. And so that I think was certainly part of her sense. Did she have problems? She would only, as I said before, express problems in terms of if they mirrored something that she could use to identify that it's a catastrophe. It's that kind of, you driving me crazy, or that kind of thing. And sons do that at times. So yeah, I'm sure there were problems, but she didn't dwell on them if they weren't usable.
So let's go to your father now.
Yeah.
Where did he go to high school?
He went to high school in Somerville, Massachusetts.
And was that a predominantly white area?
Yes.
Was he the only black in his school?
To my knowledge, probably he was either the only or one of very few.
Okay. So you said he graduated in the top of his class.
He had the best grade average in his class.
So he was the valedictorian.
And he was valedictorian, and the class was, well, I have a picture, and there has to be hundreds of folks in that class. Probably it was a close city to Boston, and it was probably 500 to 600 to 700 students in the class, graduating class, and he was on top the best student.
And I know this one, I don't know if you can answer, other than maybe just by a guessing answer, but how did that impact, was that something that your father would have expected of himself to be the valedictorian of his class? Would that have been something that he drove himself to be? That anything below that would not have been acceptable for him or for his adoptive parents?
Interesting question. My sense is that he drove himself in part because he wanted to be good. The best, I've never heard him speak in those terms. But that doesn't mean he didn't think in those terms. It meant that he never expressed that kind of thing. He was not one to tout much of being the best. He did feel, and he said it not often, but enough so it made an impression, that he wanted to feel competent. The idea that not the best, but someone who could make do whatever the situation. And an example would be that when he went into business for himself, he had a partner by the name of Rossi, and when the town that he opened up his business in was predominantly an Italian town, Italian and Irish. But many of the people who frequented the lumber company were Italian carpenters and construction people and that sort of thing, and many were people who had come over from the old country, that kind of thing, and spoke with a very distinct Italian accent, and sometimes spoke only Italian. Sometime after the company was opened, he and his partner decided that there wasn't sufficient in it for both of them, so the partner left, Mr. Rossi left. And, but the customers kept coming, in part because my father, who was someone who had been trained in language and seemed to know, or at least pick up enough Italian to speak with these people, was someone who would talk to them in Italian, and he was often referred to as, if they wanted to get his attention, hey, Mr. Rossi, calling my father Mr. Rossi. So that kind of tells you a little bit about what he found to compete, in the sense, is that he felt that, I don't know what he did about learning, whether he learned it in college or he somehow learned it through some other source. Italian, was using Italian to relate to people who wanted to feel comfortable purchasing their building materials and that sort of thing, and so that was his strategy. It wasn't to be the best, but to be someone who could communicate and deal effectively with a different population. How his high school performance helped him, certainly he got the notice of the Harvard people and maybe the placement people at the high school. But certainly he was the kind of person who, when he was there, though he was singularly quiet, his presence was clear and certainly it was a kind of presence that one would salute. That sort of thing.
So he was the valedictorian of his class, and that got him the attention of Harvard, and he got a full ride scholarship.
I might need to start
ride.
that again, Kim,
Full
so
ride.
you don't end up cutting off. Sorry, it has a
No.
limit of how
Okay.
long it runs
Yeah.
before it
Sure.
then resets, because it's not truly a video camera. 4 gigs
Was split into 3 times.
yeah, but it will only split it so many times and then it shuts it off. I'm gonna run and get a glass of water because I'm gonna keep coughing at you, unfortunately. So,
There's some sparkling water. I don't know whether Charlotte mentioned, but there's sparkling water in a on the right side of the portion of the refrigerator that's tall for tall things. There's sparkling water in a gray topped, fairly clear.
Did
there
I
are
get
actually
anyone
two in
anything?
there.
Anyone need anything?
No, no. But also you can get water, regular water, out of the closed door on the right hand side.
And I know nobody. Be interested to know who those people that he went to Harvard with the others were.
So he got a full ride scholarship.
Not Fulbright, but it was a full ride.
Right, full
Oh,
ride.
full ride. Okay. Yeah.
A full ride scholarship from Harvard.
Yeah.
And he was one of 5?
Four
One of 4?
minority individuals.
Were they all black or?
Well,
Do you know?
they weren't all American. There was at least one person whom I met at one point who was Ethiopian, and he was the son of the pretender to Haile Selassie's throne in Ethiopia. So he was. Now the interesting thing about that was that none of the 4 individuals was allowed to live in the freshman dorm because the president of Harvard at that point decreed that the freshman dormitories that were in the yard, and this is kind of Harvard speak, unfortunately, the yard being the central portion of the campus, housed the freshmen who had to live in the yard. That was mandated by the Board of Overseers and that kind of thing, except for the 4 black individuals entering the college in 1921. So he was in the class of 25, so it was 1921. And so they had to live in a rooming house off campus and commute back and forth to the campus from this off-site, so that they were not considered a part of the social fabric of the class.
So you can come to our school, but you just can't live here
Exactly. Yeah.
and experience
Exactly.
like a true
Yeah.
student.
Yeah. What effect that had, as of the other things that were seminal in his life, he never said. It was left really to Elsie, his wife, to kind of communicate some of those things that were poignant and affecting, but he would never let on.
So he received his bachelor degree from Harvard?
He never finished. He left to take care of his parents. And how long he was there, I'm not sure. But he left. He left because they were in kind of sad straits, and they left. And I suspect that he had to furnish great assistance, which he gave to them as long as they lived. Good example of things. We were a family that had sufficient means that we would go out driving on a Sunday afternoon, that kind of thing, and we would always end up visiting Uncle Jim and Aunt Jo, his adopted parents. So that was part of the ritual.
And you call them uncle and aunt, so you didn't call them
No.
Was that something you were told you were not to call them your grandparents, or was that a choice by you?
It was, I don't know, as far as I knew, when I was being introduced to them, or at least when I was cognizant of what was going on, they were Aunt Jo and Uncle Jim.
So did you call them mom and dad though?
That's interesting. I don't remember. I knew that they were as mom and dad to him, but his relationship with them was so personal and so committed, and as he introduced them to me as Aunt Jo and Uncle Jim, I never thought of anything else. He also developed a relationship to his siblings, which was an interesting one. Because, and this is where names come in a secondary clue, that he was never Jim to them, but he was Ed to them. His name, Edward Kennedy, was Edward Kenny was someone that they knew as a brother who went away. So that he had relationship with them that continued through much of their lives in some interesting way. We would go down and visit them, and the six brothers and sister were whenever Ed showed up with his son Dick, there was a party, because Ed, it was like it was almost like the prodigal son. Although he wasn't prodigal, the rest was prodigal, and he was reasonably independent and successful. And so it was certainly he was certainly didn't deny the rest of his family. So they weren't guilty. I'm not sure he, as I said earlier, I don't think he ever felt if he felt it, he never displayed animus about his parents, his real parents. What he felt, he kept very much to himself.
How old was he when he was given away?
Oh, he was probably older than 10, but less than 12. So 11, 12, 11, maybe 10, that kind of thing.
Who do you think shaped him more? His biological father, because he was with him for
Yes.
some 11
Yep.
years,
Yep.
or his adoptive?
Another good question. It's only a guess. My sense was that the situation in which he was adopted into shaped him much more, because he lived on an estate. He saw the richness of how people lived. The family was one of the first families of Boston. I think that though his adopted father was a gardener, I suspect he had the kind of wisdom that helped him make decisions of academic kinds of things and to continue. That he was privileged in a way that he played with the owners of the estate son who was his age, that kind of thing, and incidentally was in his class at Harvard. I think he was well considered by the family, the Child family, which was the owner of the name of the owner of the estate. He had a pony that he could ride and that kind of thing. He was privileged.
Yeah, he was.
And I think that influenced him considerably, because what influenced his siblings was drinking, partying. They were reasonably kind people, but not kind to themselves. Not very risk-taking, and certainly people who, though they talked well, they were had good presence. They were not people who had great horizons in their careers. The second generation had, but that was but my father's generation was one which they were almost different, as if they were sired by different males.
So really, it's not your father put you through experiences that he'd already gone through, just at a different time.
Yes.
So for him, probably differently than your mother, that was not something that was seen as foreign. What he saw it as necessity. Would you agree with that?
You're saying, as I read what your question is that he was seeing me as someone who was a surrogate, kind of thing of him, continuation of his presence or whatever, that kind of thing.
In some ways, yes.
He did not. He was one who gave little inclination of that. When he lost his job at his original area, where he was unable to buy his boss's company, he spent some time at Shady Hill, my grammar school, and he was he was someone who came to baseball practices and helped the pitcher pitch and that kind of thing. Though he wasn't an athletic kind of person, you would never see him thinking of being team. He didn't follow teams. He didn't have any kind of knowledge, or at least didn't demonstrate any kind of knowledge of what's going on a baseball or football field or anything that sort. But he was very present, and he was not only accepted, he was looked forward to as someone who was coming. I wish my dad could come and essentially play with us. So my sense was that he did not play himself out through my behavior, and I would have likely, I would have rebelled.
No, the question, the way that I'm really meaning it is that the decision that your parents made to put you in a position of plowing unfurrowed ground by sending you to a school was that was not foreign territory for your dad, because he himself had been plowing unfurrowed ground in many of the same ways. He was the only black in the school and became valedictorian, then went to Harvard. So in making that decision, that was, I'm thinking that was a no-brainer, if you will. It was an obvious choice for him to have you, you in that situation, because he'd already been in that situation himself in different ways.
My sense is that he never gave any indication of that. Did he feel that he was putting me through something that he had already been? I think he hoped for me for that. I think it was a matter of hope. But I really wonder. My sense is that I think his motivation, if that will answer what you're saying, is that here's an opportunity, seize it. Whether I've been there or not, seize the opportunity. If there's a possibility of gain, think it through, seize it. If it's offered, don't dismiss it out of hand. That was the kind of thinking that he would go through. I proposed when I was working with him in the lumber business that he get mechanism help, forklift, all those sorts of things, because all of us who worked for him were tasked by doing everything by hand. So, and by hand meant that we had to suffer with splinters and all the kinds of issues that sprained muscles and that kind of thing. He assessed the risk of investing in mechanical kinds of aids and that sort of thing, which was now coming very much into the industry. He said no, he couldn't afford it. So he was well thought out. And as I think I mentioned to you at some point or other, that he was prepared to consider a whole host of possibilities. He was one who was that analytical. And then he would make a decision, and that would be it. He would have thought it through and probably thought it through very well, and then made a decision. He was someone who was not acting on impulse, with the exception of one area, and the impulse was clothes. We would go into town and
I think the battery died, Kim.
Oh no, and I don't know when it died.
I don't know either. I'm looking and it's off.